Israel was at a breaking point. Internally divided, his people moved further and further away from what once sustained them: faith in the only God. And it was in this chaotic scenario that Jezebel emerged, a foreign queen with a hardened heart who dared to defy not only tradition, but the God of Israel himself. From afar, she seemed merely a powerful queen, but those who observed her closely soon realized that her presence brought something much more dangerous. She wasn't like the others. Jezebel brought with her a darkness that changed the destiny of a nation. Her marriage to Ahab, king of Israel, seemed to be just a strategic alliance, but it soon became the symbol of a pact with forces that God's people should never have known. Jezebel, moved by her faith in Baal, began to spread the cult of idolatry among the people of Israel. She did not accept being just a figure next to the throne. Jezebel wanted absolute control, and to achieve this, she went to great lengths to establish her religious agenda. Altars were erected, prophets of Baal were brought from their homeland, and the spiritual warfare in Israel was about to reach its climax. The people's faith began to waver. Jezebel, with her subtle manipulation and undeniable power, brought the shadow of paganism into the heart of a nation that once prided itself on following God's commandments. She despised the God of Israel, considering him weak and inattentive. The queen was sure that Baal's power would triumph over any deity who dared oppose her plans. Her blind confidence led her to believe she could rewrite the history of an entire nation. But what Jezebel didn't know was that she was about to face something much bigger than she imagined. With each act of idolatry, the tension between heaven and earth grew. Jezebel may have been in control of the court, but on the spiritual plane, the battle was just beginning. Every high point she raised, every prophet she silenced, was paving the way for a confrontation that would change everything. The question hanging in the air was not just whether Jezebel could maintain her power, but how far she would go to defy God himself. Jezebel was not just a foreigner. She was a Phoenician princess, daughter of Ethbaal, king of Sidon, and heir to a culture rooted in Baal worship. Her marriage to Ahab, the king of Israel, was a political move, but what appeared to be a simple alliance between nations became a crucial turning point in Israel's history. Ahab, a weak and easily influenced king, opened the doors of his kingdom to Jezebel without imagining that, along with her, an avalanche of spiritual destruction would enter. Marriage was the key that allowed Jezebel not only access to the throne, but also to the heart of Israel. Upon becoming queen, Jezebel was not content with the role of consort. She was determined to rule alongside Ahab, and in many moments, she seemed to be the one dictating the rules. His power was undeniable, and his goal clear: to establish Baal worship as the dominant religion in Israel. To her, Israel's faith was weak, something that could be replaced. She used her influence over Ahab to promote her god, and the king, blinded by his love and fascination with Jezebel, let her shape his nation's spiritual destiny. This union between the two sealed a pact with forces that Israel barely understood. Over time, Jezebel's power became absolute. Ahab, increasingly submissive, allowed her to rule with an iron fist. She manipulated the king and, through him, the entire government of Israel. There was no important decision that did not pass through the queen's hands. She brought with her priests of Baal, built temples, and began executing those who opposed her new order. Jezebel not only ruled as a queen, but also as the high priestess of a cult that drained the soul of Israel. Jezebel's ascension to the throne of Israel marked the beginning of a dark era. The people were divided, confused, and vulnerable. They no longer knew who to serve: the God of their ancestors or the pagan gods that Jezebel presented as more powerful. Meanwhile, Ahab watched from afar, unable to resist the magnetism of the woman he had placed at his side. But deep down, the seeds of an inevitable confrontation were beginning to germinate. The idolatry that Jezebel brought to Israel was not just a religious issue, but a true cultural revolution. She erected temples to Baal in Samaria, the capital of the kingdom, making pagan worship visible and accessible to the people. What was previously prohibited was now encouraged. Jezebel knew that, to destroy faith in God, it was not enough to replace the altars, it was necessary to corrode the soul of a nation. And so, Baal, the god of storms and fertility, became the deity most revered by many Israelites. The country that once walked under the light of God now saw its streets and mountains shadowed by the darkness of idolatry. Jezebel allowed no resistance. Those who dared to defend faith in the God of Israel were persecuted, silenced, and, in many cases, killed. She saw no limits to imposing her will. Prophets and priests were expelled, and those who still remained faithful to the Lord were forced to hide. For Jezebel, the presence of these prophets was a personal threat, as they represented direct opposition to her power and her vision of an Israel shaped in the image of Baal. She saw the worship of the God of Israel as an obstacle to be destroyed. The impact of this idolatry was profound. The people's hearts began to harden, and many, to avoid reprisals or out of simple weakness, gave in to the new customs. It was easier to worship Baal than to oppose Jezebel's will. Idolatry took over homes, squares, and celebrations. The name of God was whispered, almost in secret, by those who still had the courage to resist. The flame of faith in Israel was quickly going out, smothered by the dominance of Jezebel and her followers. However, behind this chaos, something bigger was moving. Jezebel could have imposed idolatry by force, but the real battle was not just fought in the streets of Israel. Spiritual warfare was in full swing, and God's justice was never inactive. While Jezebel was building her altars and persecuting God's servants, a divine response was being prepared, something that no pagan altar could prevent. Jezebel was not content with just replacing the worship of God with that of Baal. She made it her personal mission to eradicate any trace of true faith in Israel. The prophets of the Lord, those who still dared to preach justice and truth, were hunted down like criminals. Jezebel saw them as mortal enemies, not only of her faith, but of her authority. The order was clear: eliminate all prophets who opposed his reign and his religion. Many were executed, and others were forced to live in the shadows, hiding to survive. Obadiah, a faithful servant of God, played a crucial role in this dark moment in history. He was a highly trusted official in Ahab's court, but in secret he risked his life to protect the persecuted prophets. Hiding in caves, fed and cared for in secret, these servants of God kept the flame of faith alive in times of darkness. Obadiah is an example that even in the midst of oppression, there are always those who remain faithful and refuse to give in to fear. His silent courage contrasted with the noise of the chase. While Jezebel believed she was silencing God's voice, in reality, she was merely delaying the inevitable. Faith cannot be destroyed by brute force. Even with the threats and executions, the prophets continued to exist, hidden, but praying, waiting for the moment when God would call them to act again. Jezebel could be ruthless, but her vision was limited. She saw only what was before her eyes, an Israel in spiritual decline. However, the God of Israel had not given up on his people, and his answer was getting closer. With each prophet that fell, divine judgment approached. Jezebel's persecution only accelerated the moment when God would intervene. Those who still kept the faith knew this. Even as silence seemed to prevail, there was a growing expectation that God's inevitable and powerful justice was about to manifest. And Jezebel, with all her arrogance and thirst for power, could not escape what was to come. As Jezebel consolidated her power in Israel, one man stood up as a lone voice in the wilderness of idolatry. Elijah the prophet emerged as the spokesman of the true God, ready to directly confront the queen and the false prophets she had instituted. He was no ordinary man. Elijah carried with him divine authority and a courage that defied death itself. When everyone fell silent, Elijah became the beacon of light that Israel needed. He stood before Ahab and Jezebel with a clear message: the God of Israel would not be ignored. The culmination of this spiritual battle took place on Mount Carmel, an event that changed the course of Israel's history. There, in front of the entire nation, Elijah proposed a challenge to the prophets of Baal. The one who could bring down fire from heaven would be the true God. The prophets of Baal, in their ritualistic frenzy, cried out for hours, but received no answer. The silence in the sky was deafening. Jezebel, watching from a distance, believed her God would respond, but the only response was public humiliation. Baal, the mighty storm god, remained mute. When Elijah's turn came, he prayed with simplicity and faith. There was no shouting or extravagant rituals, just a heart surrendered to the true God. And heaven responded. An overwhelming fire descended, consuming the altar, the wood, the stones, and even the water around it. It was a moment of divine triumph that no one could deny. Baal was defeated in that instant, and the hearts of many Israelites returned to the God of their fathers. Elijah's victory on Mount Carmel was more than a demonstration of power. It was proof that the God of Israel still reigned sovereign. However, Jezebel was not intimidated. Instead of acknowledging Baal's defeat, his anger only increased. She swore to avenge the deaths of her prophets, promising to kill Elijah at any cost. The prophet knew that the victory at Carmel was just the beginning of a much greater confrontation. Jezebel, driven by hatred, was willing to defy God himself. And so, the persecution against Elijah began, paving the way for one of the most tense moments in Israel's history. The victory at Mount Carmel was a spiritual triumph, but the cost of that victory soon revealed itself. When Jezebel learned what had happened to her prophets, her anger reached unimaginable proportions. She was not a woman who accepted defeat easily, and her thirst for revenge against Elijah became personal. Jezebel sent messengers with a clear threat: Elijah would soon be killed. What should have been a moment of celebration for the prophet became a moment of fear. Elijah, who had faced hundreds of prophets of Baal, now found himself on the run, fearing for his life. In the desert, alone and desperate, Elijah experienced the weight of spiritual fatigue. He had defied kings and queens, but now he felt exhausted and hopeless. Under the scorching sun and the weight of fear, he even asked God to take his life. It was a moment of vulnerability that many of us can understand. Sometimes, even after great victories, discouragement can hit us in unexpected ways. Elijah, a man so full of faith, was now on the verge of emotional collapse. He fled Jezebel's wrath, but he could not escape the despair that surrounded him. However, God did not abandon his prophet. Elijah, who thought everything was lost, was sustained in a supernatural way. An angel appeared to him, bringing food and water, and ordering him to get up and continue his journey. It was a reminder that even in our darkest moments, God is always there, ready to strengthen us. Jezebel's power could have forced Elijah to flee, but it could not erase God's care for him. It's a lesson that resonates to this day. When we feel overwhelmed, divine care is never far away. While Elijah recovered in the midst of his flight, Jezebel continued to spread her dark influence over Israel. She was determined to eliminate any opposition to her rule. But on a spiritual level, Jezebel's persecution against Elijah did not mean her final victory. On the contrary, God was preparing something much greater. What appeared to be a momentary defeat for Elijah was, in fact, a prelude to the inevitable downfall of the queen who defied the Almighty. In the midst of her growing dominance, Jezebel found yet another opportunity to show how far her power could go. Ahab, her husband, coveted a simple vineyard belonging to a man named Naboth. For the king, that vineyard was just another piece of land that could be added to his possessions. However, Naboth, faithful to the laws of his ancestors, refused to sell his family inheritance. Ahab, weak as ever, returned to the palace empty-handed, dejected, and unable to take what he wanted. It was at this moment that Jezebel saw her chance to act. For Jezebel, Naboth's refusal was not a problem. It was just a minor obstacle that could be easily removed. With coolness and precision, she orchestrated a dark plan to eliminate Naboth. Using her political influence, Jezebel fabricated false accusations against the innocent man. Under his order, Naboth was put on trial, accused of blasphemy and treason. He was sentenced to death, stoned for crimes he never committed. As the people watched the trial, few knew that Jezebel was behind the scenes, manipulating every detail. Naboth's death was more than an unjust execution. It was a reflection of Jezebel's total lack of scruples. She had no limits in her quest for power, and eliminating anyone who opposed her plans was part of her nature. With Naboth out of the way, Ahab finally took possession of the vineyard, as if it were a communal victory. But this victory sealed the fate of both Ahab and Jezebel. The cruelty that marked this episode was a clear sign that divine justice was rapidly approaching. The episode of Naboth's vineyard reveals the heart of Jezebel, a woman willing to destroy anyone who stood in the way of her desires. However, while Jezebel boasted of her power, something greater was happening on the spiritual plane. Revenge for Naboth's death would not take long. Just as the blood of the innocent cried out for justice, heaven prepared the final judgment of the queen who defied God. His downfall was near, and this cruel act would be remembered as one of the main reasons for his condemnation. The silence following Naboth's murder was thick, but Elijah knew it would not last long. God called him to yet another mission, to confront Ahab with the truth he refused to see. The king, who had hidden behind Jezebel's malice, would now have to face the weight of his actions. Elijah, in obedience, went to the king in the field where Naboth had been unjustly condemned. There, in front of the vineyard that Ahab had taken, the prophet positioned himself once again as the voice of God. There was no more room for excuses or pretense. The truth was about to be told. When Elijah approached, Ahab recognized him immediately, and with a mixture of fear and contempt, accused him of being his enemy. But Elias was not there to hear accusations. With a firmness that only a prophet can have, he pronounced the divine sentence, "In the place where the dogs lick the blood of Naboth, they will also lick your blood, Ahab." It was a frightening prophecy, announcing the imminent end of a dynasty stained with the blood of injustice. Ahab, who had allowed Naboth's death and so many other atrocities, now faced God's own judgment. But the prophecy didn't stop there. Elijah, in his prophetic authority, also declared the fate of Jezebel. "Dogs will devour Jezebel at the wall of Jezreel." These words echoed like an irrevocable sentence. Jezebel, who believed she was above divine law, would be destroyed in a shameful and irreversible way. Her fall was sealed, and the instrument of that fall would be the divine justice that she so defied. As Ahab listened to Elijah's pronouncement, the weight of his choices began to reveal themselves with terrifying clarity. However, even in the face of such a severe prophecy, Jezebel remained indifferent. Ahab, on the other hand, trembled before the wrath of God. He, who had so often followed Jezebel's plans, now saw the ultimate price of his complicity. Elijah had spoken, and the prophet's words were the manifestation of divine justice itself. The fall of Ahab and Jezebel was near, and although they still ruled for a brief period, their lives were marked for judgment. The time of divine justice was approaching, and what had been prophesied would soon become reality. Ahab was always a divided king, a man who walked between the desire to please his people and the relentless manipulation of Jezebel. Since ascending the throne, his reign has been marked by poor decisions and an inability to resist his wife's power. Under Jezebel's control, Ahab became a shadow king, a puppet in the hands of a woman who ruled without limits. He knew that his alliance with Jezebel had been a dark pact, but, out of comfort and fear, he chose to follow her ways. Every decision Ahab made under Jezebel's influence took him further from God and brought him closer to his ruin. The war against Syria was the turning point. Ahab, driven by his pride and the constant need to assert his power, decided to fight against an enemy who had defeated him before. He surrounded himself with advisors, but ignored the only voice that mattered, the voice of God. When the prophet Micaiah tried to warn him of impending defeat, Ahab, blinded by arrogance, rejected him. He preferred to believe the false prophecies of victory that filled his ears with empty promises. The manipulative king, unable to make wise decisions for himself, was marching toward his own destruction. The final battle was a disaster. Ahab, in an attempt to deceive his enemies, disguised himself as a common soldier, thinking he could escape God's judgment. But fate cannot be avoided by human tricks. An arrow fired at random fatally struck Ahab. He slowly agonized in his war chariot while his army dispersed. When Ahab died, part of Elijah's prophecy was fulfilled. The king's blood was spilled on the same field where Naboth had been unjustly condemned, and the dogs licked his blood. Ahab's end was tragic, a testimony to the price one pays for ignoring God's justice. And Jezebel? She was still on the throne, more ruthless than ever. Ahab's death did not shake her, as she believed his power would remain intact. But while Jezebel continued to rule, the destiny that Elijah had announced was already set. What appeared to be the decline of a weak king was only the prelude to the final fall of a ruthless queen. Justice was on the move, and Jezebel would not be able to avoid it. As Jezebel continued to reign mercilessly, a silent force rose in Israel, chosen by God to bring final judgment. Jehu, a respected military commander, was anointed by a prophet at the behest of Elisha, Elijah's successor. He was not just a warrior, but the divine instrument that would carry out the sentence that hung over Jezebel and the house of Ahab. Jehu's anointing was a crucial moment in the history of Israel, as it represented the beginning of the fall of a dynasty corrupted by idolatry and injustice. Jehu knew that his mission would not be easy, but he was determined to fulfill what God had commanded. Jehu's rebellion began quickly and decisively. He gathered his men and marched directly to Jezreel, the center of Jezebel's power. News of her revolt spread quickly, and fear began to grip Jezebel's allies. Many questioned whether Jehu would really be able to overthrow the queen. However, Jehu was not acting alone. He had the support of God himself. His unwavering determination and relentless courage set him apart from leaders who had tried unsuccessfully to oppose Jezebel in the past. Jehu knew that divine justice was in his hands. As he approached Jezreel, Jehu did not encounter much resistance. Many of those under Jezebel's command knew that the end was near and decided to join Jehu, recognizing in him the agent of change that Israel so needed. The queen, who had previously seemed invincible, began to see her power crumble before her eyes. Jehu's plan was bold, to overthrow Jezebel once and for all, along with any trace of Ahab's house. He wasn't there for negotiations. He was there to execute God's justice, without mercy. Jehu's advance was relentless, and the few who tried to resist had no chance. His way to Jezebel was clear, and the time of judgment had finally arrived. Jehu, now at the head of a loyal army, was about to confront the woman who had defied God for so long. The queen, who had manipulated kings and ruled with an iron fist, would face the fate that Elijah had prophesied years before. Jezebel's end was sealed, and Jehu would be the man who would bring this story to its inevitable conclusion. When Jehu finally arrived in Jezreel, Jezebel knew that her final confrontation was approaching. However, even in the face of imminent death, the queen did not lose her characteristic arrogance. In a typical gesture of someone who refuses to accept the end, Jezebel adorned herself, putting makeup on her eyes and adorning herself with her royal robes. It wasn't just vanity, it was a last attempt at manipulation. Jezebel believed that she could, perhaps, win over Jehu with her presence, as she had done with so many others. Her indomitable spirit and belief in her power kept her standing, even when everything around her crumbled. Jehu entered the city determinedly, and upon seeing her in the window, he did what no one else had dared to do. He confronted her directly. His gaze met Jezebel's, and in that moment, any illusion of power she still harbored was shattered. The man before her was not someone who could be manipulated or influenced. Jehu, the executor of divine justice, knew exactly what he needed to do. He looked at Jezebel's servants surrounding her and gave a simple, brutal order: throw her out of the window. There was no hesitation. The servants, who had previously feared her, quickly obeyed. Jezebel's fall was as swift as her reign had been ruthless. She fell from her own tower, a symbol of her power and control. His body shattered on the ground, and Jezebel's blood spilled out, just as Elijah had prophesied. What was left of the queen was devoured by dogs, strictly fulfilling the words that had been spoken years before. The woman who considered herself indestructible now lay without dignity, her death serving as a reminder of what happens to those who defy the God of Israel. Jezebel, who stood up against the divine, fell in a shameful way. Jezebel's arrogance in the face of death is a clear lesson about the fate of the proud and unrepentant. Even with all the warnings, she refused to bow, believing that her earthly power would be enough to keep her in control. However, God's justice, although it may seem slow, never fails. Jezebel, in her last act of vanity, met the end her actions had sealed. And with that, Ahab's dynasty also came to an end, marking the beginning of a new era for Israel, where justice prevailed over evil. Jezebel's body, thrown from the window of Jezreel's palace, lay broken and unrecognizable on the ground. The queen's blood spread across the land, mixing with the soil she had so arrogantly ruled. His fate was inevitable from the moment he decided to defy the God of Israel, but the manner of his death was even more brutal than many could imagine. The dogs, the same ones that Elijah had prophesied would devour his body, arrived quickly. Before long, only fragments remained of a woman who had once been feared by everyone. Jezebel's death was more than the end of a queen. It was the exact fulfillment of divine justice. No dignified tomb was prepared for her. No grand funeral marked her passing. Instead, his body was abandoned to disdain and oblivion, as a symbol of the fate reserved for those who rise up against God. Jezebel, who manipulated kings, destroyed prophets, and spread idolatry, now found herself reduced to little more than bones scattered on the ground. His name, which once inspired fear, was now synonymous with judgment. Jehu, observing what was left of Jezebel, understood the weight of what had been accomplished. The woman who had brought Israel to the brink of ruin was finally destroyed. Elijah's prophecy, pronounced years before, had been fulfilled in every detail. Ahab's house, marked by violence and idolatry, was officially dismantled, and Jezebel, who believed she was beyond divine justice, now became an example of what happens when God's power is challenged. Justice may seem late, but it is always precise and relentless. The silence that followed Jezebel's death was profound. The reign of a woman who had transformed the kingdom with an iron fist ended as cruelly as it began. Jezebel's bloody end served as a lesson for all of Israel and for future generations. His brutal death echoed through history as a stark reminder that evil, no matter how powerful it may seem, will never prevail over God's justice. Jezebel's legacy would not be remembered for her strength, but for her destruction. And Israel, free at last, could begin again. The fulfillment of the prophecy about Jezebel was one of the most remarkable moments in the history of Israel. Elijah, the prophet who had confronted Ahab and Jezebel years before, had declared that dogs would lick the king's blood and devour the queen's body. And so it happened. Every word spoken by Elias was fulfilled with frightening precision. Divine justice was not only announced, but also perfectly executed. This fulfillment was not only a judgment against Jezebel, but also a message for the entire nation. God does not ignore evil, and His promises, whether of blessings or judgment, are always fulfilled. The fall of Jezebel and the house of Ahab brought a renewal of the fear of God in Israel. The people who had been seduced by idolatry and corruption now saw before their eyes the unshakable power of the God of their ancestors. Jezebel, who believed herself invincible, was reduced to dust. Ahab, the king who had strayed from God's path, had met a tragic end. The fate of the dynasty was sealed, and the throne now awaited new leadership. This dramatic turn was a reminder that no matter how much evil seems to prosper, God's justice always prevails in due time. The fulfillment of this prophecy also carries a personal lesson for all of us. God is faithful to His promises, and His words never return empty. This means that just as He was faithful in judging Jezebel, He will also be faithful in fulfilling His promises of care, protection, and provision for those who follow Him wholeheartedly. In the midst of a world full of injustice and corruption, we can trust that God is in control. What He promised, He will accomplish. No matter how distant fulfillment may seem, divine justice always finds its way. Israel, now free from Jezebel's oppression, began to reorganize itself spiritually. The story of his fall was a living testimony to future generations that no human kingdom, however strong or cruel, can resist the will of God. Jezebel became the definitive example of what happens when someone rises up against the Most High. And Elijah's prophecy, which once seemed impossible, now marked a new beginning for God's chosen people. The word of God was fulfilled, as it always is. Jezebel's physical death brought an end to her life, but what she represented was not buried with her. The so-called spirit of Jezebel became a symbolic reference for the power of manipulation, idolatry, and control that she personified during her reign. This spirit is not just an ancient force. It manifests itself to this day in the form of leaders, institutions, and individuals who seek to exercise absolute power, using corruption and manipulation as tools to achieve their ends. Jezebel was not the last to adopt such tactics, and the spiritual battle against this type of influence continues. The Jezebel spirit is identified by the way it distorts power and promotes idolatry. He seduces with empty promises, offering easy paths to success, but always at the expense of integrity and truth. The idolatry that Jezebel spread in Israel was not just a religious issue, but a strategy to control people's hearts and minds. Today, this same spirit can be seen in systems that extol materialism, vanity, and selfishness above all else. He calls us to place our desires above divine commands, just as Jezebel did in her day. Just like in Israel, the spirit of Jezebel also tries to silence the voices that oppose its rule. He attacks those who seek to live according to justice and truth, undermining their efforts and discrediting their messages. The persecution of the prophets in Jezebel's time is a clear example of how this spirit operates. It fears the truth, and tries to destroy it, because it knows that the truth is the only thing that can free people from its clutches. And, just as in the past, it takes courage and faith to resist this influence and remain firm in the principles that come from God. Jezebel's legacy, although dark, serves as a powerful warning to us all. He reminds us that idolatry and manipulation are still present in our world, disguised in many forms. The Jezebel spirit can be faced through a God-centered life, with unshakable faith and a commitment to the truth. The story of Jezebel teaches us that no matter how powerful this spirit may seem, it never prevails against divine justice. God's victory, as always, is guaranteed to those who remain faithful to Him. Centuries after her death, Jezebel's name reappears in the New Testament, this time in the pages of the book of Revelation. She is mentioned in one of the letters to the 7 churches, specifically the church of Thyatira. In this letter, the spirit of Jezebel manifests itself again, this time symbolizing the spiritual corruption that was invading the church, promoting immoral practices and idolatry. The reference to Jezebel in Revelation serves as a blunt warning that the same evils that destroyed Israel were also present in the nascent Christian community. The use of his name is no coincidence. Jezebel became an icon of evil that challenges God's holiness. In the letter to the church of Thyatira, the Apostle John warns about a woman who called herself a prophetess and was leading God's servants to commit immorality and become involved in idolatrous practices. This figure is compared to Jezebel for her destructive influence and deception. Just as the historical Jezebel seduced Israel into worshiping Baal, this new Jezebel was corrupting the faith of believers, leading them to stray from the teachings of Christ. The warning is clear. Tolerating this type of influence is allowing evil to grow in the heart of the church, just as Jezebel did in Israel. The use of the name Jezebel in Revelation is not just a historical allusion. It is a prophetic symbol of how the spirit of deception and idolatry can infiltrate even communities of faith. The message to the church of Thyatira is a reminder that even in times of faith, spiritual corruption can find breaches and attempt to undermine the purity of the worship of God. The fight against the Jezebel spirit is not just a physical or political battle, but a spiritual battle that continues in every generation. The spirit that once dominated Israel now sought to poison the Church of Christ. This reference in Revelation challenges us to be constantly vigilant. The Jezebel spirit can manifest itself in many different ways, disguised as good intentions or promises of success. The warning that God gave to the church of Thyatira is valid to this day. We cannot tolerate corruption in our spiritual lives. Just as Jezebel was judged and destroyed, any influence that seeks to draw us away from God will also face divine justice. The battle against the Jezebel spirit is ongoing, but, just as in the past, victory always belongs to the Lord. The story of Jezebel brings to light one of the clearest lessons in the Bible. No one can defy God with impunity. The trajectory of this powerful queen teaches us that pride and disobedience bring inevitable consequences. Jezebel not only ignored divine warnings, but deliberately set herself against God, convinced that her position, her cunning, and her manipulation could protect her from judgment. However, as we have seen, human power is fragile in the face of divine sovereignty. Jezebel believed she was in control, but in reality, her downfall was being prepared from the moment she defied the Lord. The fragility of human power is a lesson that echoes throughout history. Jezebel was not the first, nor will she be the last figure to rebel against God. Men and women throughout the ages have been seduced by the illusion that they can control their destinies, moving away from the divine will. But the story of Jezebel is a powerful reminder that divine justice may delay, but it never fails. Just as she was judged, all those who oppose God's will eventually face the consequences of their choices. The lesson here is clear. No one is above divine law. Another crucial aspect of the Jezebel story is the destructive impact of idolatry. She brought Baal to the center of worship in Israel, replacing the true God with an idol made by human hands. And this idolatry not only affected the spiritual life of the people, but also their morality and social justice. Idolatry, when allowed, corrodes the foundations of a nation or a person. It teaches us that anything we place above God, be it power, wealth, or recognition, leads us down a path of destruction. Jezebel symbolizes what happens when we turn away from what is holy and give ourselves over to what is unholy. Ultimately, Jezebel's life is a call to integrity and faithfulness. Even when evil seems to prevail, God's justice always triumphs. Her story challenges us to reflect on the areas in our lives where we may be resisting divine will. Jezebel is an extreme example, but her actions warn us about the dangers of ignoring God's voice. She teaches us that living in disobedience and idolatry may seem rewarding at first, but in the end, the cost is always greater than we are willing to pay. And it is at this point that God intervenes, bringing justice and restoration. Jezebel's reign was marked by an invisible war, a battle that transcended politics and earthly power. What was happening in Israel was more than a conflict between kings and kingdoms. It was a spiritual struggle between good and evil, between the true God and the false gods that Jezebel imposed on the people. Every act of Jezebel, from building the altars of Baal to persecuting God's prophets, was part of this spiritual battle, where invisible but powerful forces fought for the soul of a nation. What was at stake was not just Israel's future, but faithfulness to God in the midst of darkness. This spiritual warfare is a reality that was not limited to the time of Jezebel. The struggle between good and evil continues today, manifesting itself in different ways. Just as Jezebel tried to divert Israel from worshiping the true God, evil continues to try to divert hearts and minds, leading them to idolatry and sin. The battle is constant, and spiritual vigilance is necessary to not fall into the traps of evil. The story of Jezebel reminds us that evil can disguise itself in many forms, sometimes as power, sometimes as success, but its ultimate goal is always separation from God. However, even in the midst of this conflict, the victory of good is guaranteed. Jezebel believed her power was absolute, but God was in control at all times. The prophet Elijah, with his courage and faith, was proof that God would never abandon his people, even when it seemed that evil was winning. The spiritual struggle is not won by physical strength, but by unshakable faith in God. When Elijah stood against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, he not only challenged the power of Jezebel, but also demonstrated that God's power is greater than any force that opposes him. The struggle between good and evil continues, and we are all called to participate in it, not with weapons or human power, but with prayer, faith, and obedience to God's will. The story of Jezebel and her struggle against the God of Israel is a clear example that, in the end, evil never prevails. The victory belongs to the Lord, and those who stand firm in His word will be witnesses of that victory. Jezebel may have ruled with tyranny for a time, but in the end, divine justice triumphed, and good, as always, emerged victorious. Throughout Jezebel's story, there is one constant point: God's patience. For years, He allowed Jezebel to rule with tyranny and idolatry, apparently without directly interfering. But God's silence never meant approval. The time Jezebel had to rule was actually a period of grace, an opportunity for repentance. However, she did not recognize this mercy. When the moment of divine intervention finally arrived, it was swift, precise, and inescapable. God, who always watches and waits for the right moment, acted with a relentless justice that could no longer be ignored. This is the standard of divine justice. It may seem slow to human eyes, but it is always accurate. Jezebel had built her life and her reign on manipulation, idolatry, and innocent blood. For a long time she believed she was above judgment, convinced that her strategies would keep her safe. But God's justice cannot be avoided, and when He decides to intervene, not even the greatest queen is able to protect herself. Jezebel's end was proof that, no matter how much evil seems to prosper, it will always have a limit. God, in His time, always corrects what is wrong. This divine intervention also reveals God's character as righteous. He not only sees evil, but also acts against it at the appropriate time. This should bring comfort to those who, in the midst of injustice, feel powerless. Jezebel seemed untouchable for so long, and those who suffered under her tyranny might wonder if God was indifferent. But divine justice does not fail. When God intervenes, He does so in a way that shows His power and sovereignty. Jezebel, who once saw herself above divine law, was publicly humiliated as an example that no one can escape God's judgment. This story teaches us that we must trust in God's justice, even when it seems to take time. He knows exactly the right time to intervene, and when He does, it is to put all things in order. Jezebel challenged God's patience, but she could not escape His justice. And just as she faced divine judgment, all those who walk the path of injustice and evil will eventually meet the same fate. God's justice does not fail, and it is always a powerful force when we choose to live according to His ways. Although the events surrounding Jezebel took place millennia ago, her story still resonates strongly today. The figure of Jezebel became an archetype of power, corrupted by idolatry, manipulation, and selfishness, characteristics that we still see in many spheres of modern life. Today's culture is filled with examples of leaders and influences who resemble the Jezebel spirit, using their power to advance their own agenda without regard for the well-being of others. The relevance of her story lies in the way she warns us about the dangers of living away from divine truth, embracing a lifestyle based on pride and self-sufficiency. In the modern world, idolatry may not manifest itself in the form of statues of Baal, but hides in other idols: money, fame, power, and materialism. Just as Jezebel brought idolatry into the hearts of Israel, today we are constantly tempted to place these false gods above God in our lives. The unbridled pursuit of success and recognition at the expense of our spiritual values is a modern way of following in the footsteps of Jezebel. His story serves as a warning to remain vigilant, aware that the world still tries to divert us from the path of truth. In addition to idolatry, the manipulation and control that Jezebel exercised are also present today in power relations, whether in politics, at work, or even in personal matters. She manipulated Ahab, distorted justice, and eliminated anyone who opposed her plans. This type of behavior is reflected in individuals and systems that place their interests above the common good. By understanding Jezebel's story, we can recognize the negative influences in our own society and stand against them. The story of Jezebel teaches us the importance of discerning and resisting these forces that try to lead us astray. Therefore, the story of Jezebel is not just an account of the past, but a mirror for our times. She challenges us to reflect on how we are leading our lives and to identify the modern idols who may be taking God's place in our hearts. His actions and his downfall are reminders that evil, no matter how seductive it may seem, always brings destruction in the end. Just as Jezebel met her fate by defying God, anyone who follows this path will see that, in the end, divine justice prevails. Jezebel's story is, above all, a call to integrity and fidelity amid the temptations of a corrupt world. Jezebel's story ends with a powerful message. Those who defy God, sooner or later, face the consequences of their choices. Jezebel, who once ruled with an iron fist and seemed invincible, was reduced to nothing. Her arrogance, her idolatry, and her cruelty led her to a tragic end, as God Himself had announced. There is no earthly power that is capable of resisting divine judgment. What Jezebel teaches us is that pride and the desire to control everything around us are traps that can keep us away from God and, in the end, destroy us. His fall is a stark reminder that evil never goes unanswered. To those observing Jezebel's story from a distance, it may appear that she was successful for much of her life, but that success was built on a fragile and corrupt foundation. When we defy God and stray from His commandments, we may seem to prosper for a time, but in the end, justice always comes. And that's exactly what happened to Jezebel. She believed she was above everything and everyone, but she discovered the hard way that no one can escape divine justice. His end was brutal and public, serving as a warning to all who follow in his footsteps. The story of Jezebel is an invitation to reflection. How many times in our own lives have we tried to control everything around us, ignoring divine principles? How many times do we put our wills above God's will? Like Jezebel, we are called to ask ourselves, are we living in alignment with the values God has given us? Or are we defying His justice with our own hands? Jezebel's tragic ending teaches us that true success comes not from power or manipulation, but from living in harmony with God. This is the path that brings peace, security, and, in the end, true victory. And so Jezebel's life ends as an eternal example that evil, no matter how powerful it appears to be, will always fall before the justice of God. His story continues to be told, not as a legacy of glory, but as a warning to each of us. Jezebel had the opportunity to repent, but she chose the path of destruction. May we learn from her, always choosing the path of obedience, humility, and faith. Because, in the end, this is what truly keeps us firm before God.
If you're interested in having a Bible like the one we use in our studies, check out the link in the first pinned comment. If you enjoy our content and can support our channel, consider buying us a coffee through Buy Me a Coffee. Additionally, if you can purchase a crucifix, we also have a link in the first pinned comment. We greatly appreciate your support. God bless and see you in the next video.